En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 25 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Medellín el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo, promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Bueno, muy buenos días a todas las personas que se conectaron a este webinar con Jon Cohen que hemos titulado el periodismo sobre ciencia, el reto de cubrir la incertidumbre. Todos los que están desde la punta de Chile, allá hasta el Río Bravo en México y quizás más arriba también, pues bienvenidos. Quiero recordarles que este webinar que tenemos hoy hace parte de un programa mucho más amplio de formación y de estímulo al periodismo sobre ciencia en Latinoamérica, que es una deuda que tenemos todos. Y este proyecto pues es gracias a la Fundación Gabo, obviamente, que hoy nos acoge a todos de esta manera virtual hoy, y al Instituto Serrafileira en Brasil, que también ha sido el principal promotor y motor de esta iniciativa, y contamos con el apoyo también de la Oficina Regional de Ciencias de la UNESCO para América Latina y el Caribe. Entonces, como les decía, este es el comienzo de un programa. Hoy vamos a charlar con uno de los mejores periodistas de ciencia del mundo, Jon Cohen. Ya se los voy a presentar, pero también vamos a elegir unos 16 periodistas que van a participar en un taller de formación, como los talleres al estilo de la herencia pues, que nos dejó García Márquez de cómo formar periodistas. Cada uno de ellos luego va a recibir cerca de $2.500 como una beca de producción periodística, va a tener que desarrollar una historia en este taller que hemos llamado Inmersión en el periodismo sobre ciencia, un método para desconfiar. Entonces, si quieren más información, los que ya están conectados pueden entrar, obviamente, a la página de la Fundación y hacerse una mejor idea. Esta conversación, pues John, el español de John está bastante bueno, ya lo probamos, pero hemos decidido que mejor sea en inglés para sacarle más provecho a todo lo que nos va a contar. Les recuerdo ahorita, antes de comenzar el evento, seguramente vieron un aviso en el que les explica, que lo están viendo ahorita en pantalla, cómo conectarse para escuchar la traducción en español. Es muy fácil, simplemente entran a esta app a.interaction.io, ponen la clave Gabo y ya van a empezar a escuchar la traducción en español. Entonces, pues con esto ya quiero invitar a Jon Cohen. Jon, bienvenido.
Gracias por invitarme y quiero hablar.
Un placer de verdad tenerte.
Quiero hablar en español, pero mi español no es fuerte. Eso es mejor en inglés. Gracias.
Sí, vamos a intentarlo. Bueno, Jon is a staff writer with Science magazine. And have published in the New Yorker, Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times Magazine, Smithsonian, Technology Review, Outside, Slate, Wire, and pay attention to this detail. In 2011, he was editor for Wavelines, an online surfing magazine, but he just published 11 glorious issues, as he used to say. Jon is specialized in biomedicine and focused on HIV and AIDS, other infectious disease, obviously, immunology, vaccines, and global health. And because he is a very hard worker, he wrote the book Shots in the Dark. I love that title, Jon. This is the wayward search for an AIDS vaccine. He also wrote Coming to Term Uncovering the Truth About Miscarriage. He also wrote Almost Chimpanzee, Rewrong the Lines that Separate Us from Them. And one last book, Tomorrow is a Long Time, Tijuana's Unchecked HIV/AIDS Epidemic. So, Jon, welcome. And it's really a big pleasure for us to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Pablo.
I'm going to start by reading the letter that Jon received when he was beginning his career. And so let me read this because it's fascinating. So this is an editor who sent you this letter, right? Dear Mr. Cohen, cute, but give me something I can use. You can write, so what? Tailor your talent to each individual market. Starving writers deserve not to eat until they discover marketing. Welcome to reality. San Diego Magazine can use anyone with writing talent. You have that, but first person stuff, anyone on this staff can do by skipping lunch. Don't waste the stamp sending stuff to any magazine unless you have studied that they use. We haven't published first-person essays in 36 years. That was seems to be a devastating start for a writer. How did you find out? But I want to hear like an anecdote about this letter and tell us how did you find out that you were a science journalist that you wanted to.
It was a fascinating letter. My wife, who's also a journalist, she was my girlfriend at the time, and we had just got married, and she saw the letter and she thought it was devastating. And I read the letter and I said, he said I can write. I took it as encouragement. His point was very helpful to me, actually. I didn't read their magazine. I didn't like their magazine. I had written a story that I didn't know what to do with. And I sent it there because I was just taking a guess that maybe it would work there.
And what was the story about?
So I finished my undergraduate degree in science writing. I was going to go to medical school, but decided very late in my education that I didn't want to be a doctor. And my university allowed me to change my major in my final year to science writing. And when I finished school, I also used to work on automobiles. And I bought a car and put all my money into fixing a car. And as soon as I rebuilt the engine, the car blew up and I lost all my money. And I rebuilt the engine again, and it started to be winter and the rains came, and I put the engine on the kitchen table to work on it. And my girlfriend, who became my wife, said, it's either the engine or it's me. So I rebuilt the engine again, and then I couldn't sell the car. So it was a tragedy of errors. And it was a good story. It was funny. But it wasn't right for that magazine. And many years later, the magazine gave me an award for being one of the most notable San Diego residents. And so I faxed them that letter.
Oh, really? Wow. So, and when did you discover that you want to become a science writer?
Well, I didn't want to become a science writer. I didn't want to be a doctor. And I had to, as part of my education, work in a hospital to go to medical school. And one day I was holding a baby that had a tube coming from the head, and I passed out. I fainted and fell on the floor. And I didn't hurt the baby, but a nurse came up to me and looked down at me and she said, maybe you shouldn't be a doctor. And so I decided that I loved writing. I loved journalists. Every time I would publish something, because I would publish things occasionally, I felt like these are my people and this is what I should be doing. It was my community. Every time I got with people who wanted to go to medical school, I felt an allergy. And many of my friends were doctors, but I didn't like young people who wanted to become doctors and talked about going golfing on Wednesdays. It just didn't matter to me. I made up my major in science writing only as a way, really, to get out of a corner that I had trapped myself in. And then I didn't do science writing for many years.
Now that you mentioned that, I remember when I met you in a HIV conference in Mexico, like 18 years ago. That was exactly the advice that you gave me. I also attended medical school, and I remember that quote, like, you will recognize your tribe. You will recognize the people like you, and that's exactly what happened to me. I feel more comfortable with journalists, and especially with science journalists. Great. Well, so Jon, I want also to read to the people who are attending this webinar the first note that you wrote about SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah.
The title was "Scientists Urge China to Quickly Share Data on Virus Linked to Pneumonia Outbreak." This is from January 8th to 2020. And for me, this only means that, for the people who are listening, that Jon is this kind of journalist who is in the game. That's an expression we have here in Colombia. I don't know if in the States.
Yeah.
And so I want to know what was the hardest thing for you this year as a journalist. In a conversation we had a few months ago, you said that it was the speed at which science is moving. I want to know why, and maybe you want to highlight something else.
Yeah, so when I started to do science writing professionally in really around 1989, 1990, I really fell in love with infectious diseases and outbreaks and vaccines. So when this pandemic began, it had my name on it. It's something that I've covered for many, many years in more than 50 countries, all over Latin America also. And on January 8th, my life changed because I felt a responsibility to report the story. Everyone in the world who's a journalist suddenly became an infectious disease reporter. I one time went to a hepatitis C conference, a disease that infects hundreds of millions of people. And the lead of my story was there was only one journalist at the International Hepatitis C conference. But now suddenly everybody was doing it, and there was a lot of information that wasn't either accurate or framed in a way that I thought was most helpful. Plus, because I've done this for so many years, and many of the scientists and doctors who were at the front of the response were people who were part of my work family. So I was able to communicate with people at the front in a different way than most reporters. And I think one thing all of us want is to feel useful. And I felt extremely useful, that I could really help clarify things and also confront things that weren't true, question things in the way that, journalists can with independence. And I had a very supportive team of people I was working with at Science Magazine, who are also, many are very good infectious disease reporters. My editors are very experienced. So as a team, we all just went into overdrive, working, some days I slept really, 4 hours in the night, and it was frantic. And that went on really until the vaccines first showed that they worked and were safe. So the beginning of 2021, things started to calm down. It wasn't as like I had barbells on my chest. It was hard to breathe for me for much of the year, and not because of the virus, but because the news was moving so quickly, and because there's so much uncertainty in any outbreak. It's always, there's a fog of epidemics. It's a fog of outbreaks. Everybody wants to know with great clarity, when will this end? My mother, who's 91 now, she would ask me every day, when will this end? And she represented how everyone felt. And everybody wanted to know answers to questions. Where does the virus come from? When will there be a treatment? how many people are getting infected, what's the case fatality rate? All these questions didn't have good answers. And even the vaccine questions till this day remain extremely confusing. So I feel a responsibility to help bring what I can to the table, to make things clear and to push the conversation in a direction that I think is most useful and productive for all of us. And I don't have delusions of grandeur. I'm one journalist with one platform. If my work becomes part of the conversation, I'm very happy. I don't give a shit about clicks and the traffic. That's not what matters to me. What matters to me is that people who are seriously involved with the problem and the response are discussing things that I'm writing about. That's what makes me happy. If somebody I respect tweets my story, that makes my day. One person, not if I get 500 hits an hour. And I think there's a craziness in journalism right now about traffic. And I like to point out that McDonald's sells more hamburgers than anyone, and I can't stand their hamburgers. They're terrible. And if you come to the United States, you know that we love our hamburgers. I would never take you to McDonald's.
No, it's nice that you raised this point, because it's something that we are facing right now. And you said that everybody, like hundreds of people, suddenly became science journalists all around the world.
Yeah, everybody, yeah.
And we saw mistakes from even in the from the New York Times to the smallest local newspaper or media in a small country. I want to know if, do you dare to list some of the most common mistakes journalists made when covering this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it's not hard to do. I mean, but before I do that, let me say the coverage by the media has been the best science reporting I've ever seen, because so many organizations, the reporters have become very, very good. And I don't like all the competition. The competition's fantastic in every country. I read journalism from all over the world, and I learn things from journalists everywhere. So by and large, I'm very impressed with what journalists have done in helping to inform the public. But the common mistakes is the public feeds on fear. If you look at movies and the sales of movie tickets, then at the very top are horror movies. People like to be scared. We cannot play into that fear. And everybody, we have the story of Chicken Little, the sky is falling. We have to be very careful to not feed the appetite the public has for doomsday. Oh no, everything is horrible. At the same time, we have to resist buying into the narratives of companies trying to make money, of researchers trying to increase their attention to their work. We have to be very careful to not overemphasize small scientific reports from 5 people in this place, and to be very critical, like the hydroxychloroquine story. There was no debate there. There was never any evidence that it worked. And so many journalists bought into the bullshit. And we also have politics everywhere in each country that are trying to influence and steer the narrative. And every country, for journalists, that's an incredible challenge, to either not be buying into what the leadership is saying, or to not be attacking the leadership just because they've done many things. I'll give you a strong example. Donald Trump did not respect science and repeatedly did things against the advice of scientists and medical doctors. At the same time, he launched Operation Warp Speed that put $12 billion into speeding the testing and production of vaccines. And it was an excellent idea, and it was run by really smart people who did a terrific job. And I think we had a lot of journalists who couldn't separate the craziness of the Trump administration with the Trump administration doing something that was very positive and effective. And that's the challenge, is figuring out how to retain your balance and in the midst of a storm. And it was a storm, and it still is a storm. There are lots of winds blowing still.
Well, science journalists, we used to we use a lot of metaphors or analogies to try to explain ourselves and the other people what we are covering. Now you compare the pandemic with the storm. Many journalists compare the pandemic with a war. What's your favorite metaphor for the pandemic? Do you like the war analogies or not that much?
Well, I mean, there's a whole literature about not using war and disease. I mean, Susan Sontag, wrote a book criticizing that idea. I do think we're at war, but I think there's one enemy and we're all in it together. That's one of the most frustrating things to me. The enemy is the virus. And, we all as a world are facing the same thing. We don't behave that way. And just look at vaccine distribution. It's tilted very strongly toward wealthy countries. And that doesn't show any sign of being in a war together. That's like, the enemy is serious. We approach it seriously in one place and not seriously in another. I mean, one of the things that where I live, we have wildfires here, and I've had to evacuate my house before. And when you live in a place where there are fires, you pay attention to the media very closely. Where's the fire now? Is my house in danger? Is my family in danger? Do I need to move? Do I need to, go help my brother who's in another part of town? You constantly are listening to the radio, watching the television, reading the internet, because you want to see where the fire is moving. That's the mode I think the public has been in with this. That's better than a war description, because the wind keeps changing and the flames keep getting put out by many things, vaccines, by social distancing and masking. But then the flames erupt again because there's a new variant. So that to me is really how I perceive it metaphorically.
Okay. So you are based in San Diego. You're right now in San Diego.
I live on la frontera de México.
Yes, and this when you wrote this article, this magazine about surfing, it was because you still surf in San Diego?
I live 5 blocks from the ocean. I also write for this magazine, which I love, the Surfer's Journal. I love writing about surfing, and it's the other side of my brain. I like science, and I can go very deep into molecular biology or genomics or anything. But I also like being stupid and just riding waves and having fun. I like playing music. I like doing things that have nothing to do with science. So for me, it's relaxing and fun to write about surfing, and in part because it isn't serious and because there's really nothing at stake. With science and the stuff that I focus on in biomedicine, we're talking about life and death. We really are. That's what's at stake. And I observe, as a science journalist who covers this, I observe many things that break my heart. I've been into intensive care units with people dying from COVID. I've seen rooms full of people suffering, and it's hard. It's emotionally difficult for me. But surfing, there's nothing difficult emotionally other than
it's a good hobby. Jon, which was the first epidemic you wrote about, or you cover, or you traveled to cover?
Well, I became interested in science writing when I was an undergraduate in my major about polio. And Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine, had an institution adjacent to my university. And I convinced him to cooperate with me on my undergraduate major project and let me write about him, with the agreement that I wouldn't publish what I wrote. That was,
wow.
Yeah, that's how I began, really. I loved polio. And I read a book when I was 13 called Breakthrough by Richard Carter about the development of the polio vaccine and Jonas Salk. And I wrote a book report, which I found many years later when I was 13 years old, about the polio vaccine. So that's really the genesis. And then Jonas Salk became a big part of my life for many years until he died. I wrote about him a lot. I spent a lot of time with him personally.
Great inspiration. And are you surprised about what's going on with the anti-vaccines right now? Because if you wrote about this issue so many years ago, how do you interpret it?
There's been vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaccination movements since the first vaccine that Edward Jenner made in 1798. So no, there's nothing new to me about people being afraid of vaccines or against vaccines. It, of course, has a different connotation now because the reasons for the vaccine hesitancy or the vaccine rejection are different. You know, one of the curious things about this vaccine is so far it's mainly for adults. And a lot of anti-vaccine sentiment has been about vaccinating children. So in the United States, it's become mixed up with politics and the notion of liberty, which is kind of a new twist. Not entirely a new twist. People who've objected to vaccines long have said, it's my body, don't tell me what to do with it. But as I mentioned, we're all in this together. And this is like the country being invaded and some people saying, you go fight, I'm not going to fight, you'll take care of me. And what's funny to me is many of the people in this country who are most vaccine hesitant or against vaccine are the very same people who most want a strong military and want strong police. You know, they want strength. But until it comes to this, then their brains disengage. You know, and we enter into really ridiculous discussions. If you have looked at any chart that shows, like in the United States, who is in the hospital right now, if you look at any chart, it's overwhelmingly people who are not vaccinated. I mean, you don't need any more evidence than that, that the vaccines are working. And we know they're safe because they've been in really, at this point, you know, billions of doses have been used. So the movement, the anti-vaccine movement, which I separate from the vaccine hesitant, most people are not against vaccines, they're hesitant. And they're hesitant for very rational reasons. Why do you want to inject anything into your body? You know, who injects things? People who have diabetes and have a need for a medicine, or people who have an addiction to heroin. But most of us, I never inject. I don't get up in the morning and inject anything. I take some pills every day for medical reasons. If the vaccine was a pill, and there are some vaccines that are pill, there would be less hesitancy. I'm sure. People also are afraid of needles, you know. So I think some of the hesitancy is extremely rational. But when you see the evidence that has built to date and the way that these vaccines, people worry, oh, they were done too quickly. What, you wanted to take your time at a war in order to defend yourself? Oh, our soldiers will wake up next year. They're busy watching television, playing video games. What are you talking about? Yes, we moved quickly, and we did it in a very strategic, public, transparent way. I'm extremely proud of the way the United States, with its Food and Drug Administration, showed us transparently at public meetings, webinars, all the data, good and bad. I could evaluate it. Everyone could evaluate it. That's how it should be done. Other countries, I think, blew it. I think countries that put vaccines into people before having strict regulatory review made big mistakes and fed hesitancy. And I think that Donald Trump's administration did that with things like hydroxychloroquine and giving that an emergency use authorization. It created a sense that anything goes. The politicians can push anything through. But with the vaccines, the scientists and the companies stood up to the Trump administration and said, no, we're going to follow the science. and we're going to do it transparently. And I applaud that. I think that was terrific. And that you see in Brazil, the politics there have been, with Bolsonaro, have been just as difficult as the politics in the United States. And you see it in Russia, and you see it in China.
John, I think we are having a small problem. Jaime is telling me that the translation stopped. So we can try a little for a few minutes in Spanish, if you want.
Okay.
Va a estar bien.
Okay. Espero. No sé.
Tal vez Jaime nos pueda aclarar por el chat si ya continuó. No, it seems like it's working.
Okay, posible debo hablo más despacio porque es muy rápido en inglés. Es mejor cuando es un poco más despacio, ¿no?
It's fine.
Okay.
Our audience knows something. In a regular year, you used to write about 50,000 words if
That's
you
right.
add all your articles. But last year, you told me that you wrote 150,000. That's amazing. And well, for me, I'm surprised that you know how many words you write because I don't have any idea how many I wrote. But could you tell us about your routines as a science journalist? If someone wants to become like a science journalist, give him this person an idea.
Yeah, so it's true. Last year I wrote more than I ever have in any year of my life. And I do count my words at the end of the year. I make an Excel sheet of every story and every word. We have a review at Science of what did we produce also. So it's not just me being obsessive compulsive. It's not like I have, some mental problem.
Okay, nice to hear that.
I have mental problems, but that's not the problem. So no, what my routine is, I get up early. I get up because I surf for many years. I used to ride waves before the sun came up in the dark when there were few people in the water. So I'm used to getting up right before the sun rises. And I work typically a 12-hour day. But I also take a nap every day, half hour, maybe, not long. And if the waves are good, maybe I sneak away and jump in the water. So I try to keep some balance. I read my emails in the morning. I read my chats. I use Twitter to see what other people are talking about. I communicate with a lot of scientists and doctors every day, just checking in. I described them earlier as my work family. That's how I see it. I'm part of this big network of people who like to talk about new ideas and debate them. I read a lot of new papers that I find. I find them either because people have sent them to me, or I get a press release, or I look at preprints like medRxiv or bioRxiv and just scan them quickly. I get long lists every day of stories that are on, like I do Google alerts and I look at what's new. I look at the news stories. But all of that's a background too. It depends on whether I have a story myself that's in the editing process. And if I do, then I'm writing or I'm revising and I'm not reading. I'm reading me and reading the comments. And, journalism, it's garbage day today. So you're going to hear a big truck in a moment. Journalism requires very thick skin because it's all about, in my mind, other people making me look smarter than I truly am in reality. My editors are helping me look a lot smarter than I am because my first drafts, if they appeared like people do on blogs, they're not as good as my last draft. I have to be honest about it. I benefit from the criticism, but it's a tremendous amount of criticism. That's why many people don't like journalism, because they don't like people telling them all the time that their ideas need to be reformed or reshaped or are stupid or what. And editors often are in a hurry and they don't hold my hand. They're not, it's not.
This is a standard process with all the articles you write?
Yeah, when I write an article, it typically goes through between the first editor. We typically go back and forth between 3 to 5 times. If it's a difficult story that's having some problems, maybe it will go back and forth 7 times. Then it goes to another editor who's a top editor who maybe has completely different ideas about things. And then I go back and forth with my first editor 1 or 2 times. Then it goes to a copy editor. And then it goes into pages if it's a print story. And then we read and revise it when it's in pages. So
and it was possible to keep going this process during the pandemic?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, sometimes we did shortcuts. You know, for example, question and answer stories. That's a shortcut. If I interview you and I transcribe the question and answer, I do a short 3-paragraph top that talks about Pablo Correa, and then it's all the questions and answers. And I can turn that story around very quickly. Because let's be honest, the real challenge in journalism is, number one, deciding what to throw away, what not to use. And number 2 is transitions, getting from paragraph to paragraph. That's where people make the most mistakes, is getting from one paragraph. That's where editors introduce mistakes, because they don't think there's a smooth transition. So they put in ideas maybe that the writer doesn't notice aren't accurate, only trying to make a smoother narrative. And when you do a question and answer, you don't have to worry about transitions. You can move the questions and answers around. It's a very fast way. So we did a lot of question and answers during the year 2000.
Okay, I think we are getting close to this conversation, and I will raise some of the questions that people are sending to us, Jon, but I want to ask you something else. How do you, well, you already gave us a glimpse of this, but how do you monitor what is happening in science? Because, for example, this year, scientists published more than 100,000 articles on the coronavirus pandemic. And some people say that it exceeds to 200,000. How do you navigate through this?
One of the things I learned in university was how to use a library. When I was a child, I didn't really know how to use a library. But when I went to university, I could go into a library and find the best books. That's what I try to do. It's a library. There are millions of books in a good library. How do you find the 3 that matter to you? Well, you know how to use the card catalog. You know how to talk to the reference librarian. You know how to read one book and read the opening introduction where they talk about another book. You find ways to link, and that's what journalists do. We filter information. And if you're not good at filtering information, you're not a good journalist. I don't care what the subject is. So yes, there has been a fire hose of information coming at us, but I am in contact with really smart people. I listen to what they say. I ask them questions. What are you reading? And I go to meetings when we're allowed to go to meetings. I read a tremendous amount. I have a good bullshit detector. I have a built-in one. I was born with one. And you know the old saying, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. You know, I come from that school of journalism where, yeah, maybe. And I kind of approach everything with curiosity and skepticism, not cynicism. But I go through a lot of information every day. Most of it, I'm not going to write about. Much of what I do when I read my email is delete, 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 delete. I'm very good at that. And when something catches my eye, I then have to convince my editors that it's worthwhile. And I get excited about many things that my editors tell me to calm down and go have my nap, because they think I get excited too easily about things, which is good. You know, I have 10 ideas every day, Pablo, and only one of them is really great. And I can't tell the difference. I'm excited about all of them. I have so many ideas today.
and you also are in a hurry because you are writing a big piece for science, and I know we are disturbing your writing a little for
No,
during this hour?
I'm enjoying this. This is like going for a surf. It's a nice break. My day
No,
started at 5:30 and it will go until 6 p.m.
and we are very grateful because I think it's very important to have examples like you in Latin America, people who want to pursue a career in this, like understanding that behind is a lot of work, a lot of good journalism, skepticism, and all the things that you already mentioned. So we have a question here, John, from Stephanie Lopez.
Hola,
And Stephanie is asking, how do you manage to write without creating a crisis? I have experience writing about environment and something I find challenging. I find it challenging to write creating conscience, but without implying a tone that might sound catastrophic.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and let me give an example. There are variants of the coronavirus, and Delta, we know, is moving much faster than the other viruses and is creating a lot more disease. But the challenge is to put it in perspective. Are the vaccines failing to the point where the hospitals are filling up with people who have Delta and are dying from Delta? No, not with vaccinated people. So yes, Delta is a problem, and let's put it properly into perspective. That's the challenge, I think. And we don't, as journalists, want to exaggerate in either direction. I don't want to pretend that Delta isn't a problem, but I don't want to pretend, and there's a word scariant instead of variant. I don't know if it translates into Spanish, but you can make the scariant story again and again. There are going to be more variants, I promise you. That's what viruses do.
That's a good example, but I have also a question about that. At the beginning of the pandemic, when you read the percentage of people that will die from coronavirus, and at the beginning they were said less than 0.5% or 0.3% of the people who get the virus will die. How you put this in perspective?
Well, there was a report from China in February of 2020 that came with the WHO mission to China, where they had a huge number of people and explained the different outcomes. And what we learned from that report was that if you were over 80 years old, you had an extremely high chance of dying, like 20%. And if you were under 80, you had a high chance of dying if you had specific comorbidities, diabetes, hypertension. And we also know that the vast majority of people who become infected with the virus will either have an asymptomatic infection or mild disease. The problem that people have is understanding risk and benefit. It's, you know, we're talking about Russian roulette with a gun that has one bullet and 6 chambers. Yeah, most of the time you pull the trigger, nothing will happen. But, you know, what sort of responsibility do I have to my 91-year-old mother? You know, even if the virus comes to me and it's not hurting me, if I go with her, I'm hurting her, not intentionally, but that's part of the challenge, I think, of reporting this. Is it's not simply about the case fatality rate. And we also have to keep in mind that if this virus killed children at 20%, we would have a completely different perspective about our response. Completely different.
And I think that what you just mentioned is connected with the next question. This question is from Lisette Viviana Salamanca Galvis. And she wants to have from you some advice of how to translate scientific languages, the scientific information into a more public and broad languages.
Yeah.
The science journalists are, there's a very good writer from here in Colombia Julio César Londoño, and he used to describe science journalists as a messenger, someone who take the message from the science community, translate it, and give it to the public. What would be your advice for Lisette?
Hablo dos idiomas, inglés y science. Separado, dos idiomas. Y es importante hacer una distinción sobre el idioma de science. Pero my job is no solamente habla translation. That's a part of the job, but it's the same as cuando habla español or habla inglés. That's only part of communication, is the fact that you can speak another language. The real challenge, it's good to be bilingual. That's fantastic. It allows me to understand science on a very deep level. But my job is not simply to be a translator or to be an interpreter. It's to put it into a context and a framework that helps people understand what we were just talking about, how to not exaggerate in either direction, and to connect to other. Many times a story I do is about 3 different findings on the same topic, and I try to make sense of how they fit together. That's not about being an interpreter or a translator. That's about somebody thinking through, how do we make sense of something? And to make sense of something is far more challenging than simply translating. Por ejemplo, cuando hablo español, es posible hablar en español por 5 minutos, no problema. Pero por 1 hora es un gran problema, porque los subjectos son muy diferentes y mi vocabulario no tengo muchas palabras. Eso es muy diferente, es difícil. Es en todo diferente idea. Okay, is that clear?
It's very clear. And Julieta Vignale, she wants to know, what are your thoughts about generalist journalism versus science journalism?
Well, the fact that I am a niche journalist who specializes in infectious disease and vaccines and immunology has opened up a career for me. And if you're a generalist, it's more difficult to find a job that will remain steady for a long time. At the same time, I was a generalist for many years. For 5-6 years, I didn't do science journalism, which trained me to think more broadly. And I covered police. I covered the mayor. I've covered everything. And so I'm willing to write about anything. And I had a mentor when I was young who said, you must think like a poet. And a poet wants to know everything. And so I've kept that close to me. I want to know everything. But the fact that I specialize gives me a paycheck in a way that is more secure and simpler. And anyone who's young and starting in journalism, I would encourage you, if you like it, I would encourage you, throw yourself at it, because it's a fabulous way to make money. It's a fabulous world of ideas that I live in. And I've been able to travel because of my journalism extensively. And I've been so fortunate because of the doors that open with curiosity and how I am welcomed everywhere I go, because people perceive me as there to try to help. And especially that's because of what I specialize in, where I travel with doctors and nurses and I come to a village. I'm welcomed. It's been a fantastic career for me. And I would encourage you to pursue something you're passionate about. Even though most science doesn't interest me, the parts that do, I love.
Okay, great. I just realized that Lisbeth Fogg is following this broadcast. I'm really happy to know that. I used to call her the mom. Wants to know if your opinion, if science journalism is to inform or to educate.
Well, we're not educators, we're not teachers, but of course what we do does educate people. But the job is, to me, it's to tell people things they don't know in ways that are interesting or significant or both. Some things are just interesting. and they may not be educational, but they're interesting. I did a story about a man who designed an artificial surfing wave that a scientist, is it significant? Does it educate you? No. Is it fun? Is it interesting? Hell yes. So I don't feel a responsibility to be a teacher, but I do feel a responsibility to tell you things you don't know, which is what the word nuevos means, news, new, and to do it in a way that's fair and accurate. And if it educates, fantastic. If it doesn't, I'm okay with that. If it entertains you, I'm okay with that. I like entertaining people. That's part of the job.
I agree, totally agree. And well, we have another question from Nora Perdomo, and she is asking, how much can science journalism impact the public and their way of thinking, and such as an anti-vaccines?
Well, a tremendous
or
amount.
Maybe more example, we already go through that.
Yeah, well, we talked about the metaphor and the fire. You know, we're living through a wildfire now with this virus, and people they're hungry for information about the virus and about ways to protect themselves. I think we can do a tremendous amount to help people make better decisions. But people are going to make the decisions they make. And I'm going to say this in a very crude and blunt way. Smarter people make smarter decisions. And I don't mean educated people. That's life. Some people are going to drive their automobile at 170 kilometers an hour after drinking 4 bottles of beer. They're going to do that. And they're going to get hurt, or they're going to hurt someone else, or both. And we know that. And so smarter people don't do that. And so you have to accept that we're very different, and everywhere has diversity. And my job is to put out the best information and hope that the words land in the right place. And I can't control that. People use my stories all the time to make arguments that are against what my story is saying. All the time.
Jon, we are getting to the end. I have 2 quick questions for you. One is, what is the science journalism story that you are most proud of in your entire career, perhaps because of the impact it had, or because how demanding it was to investigate it, or because the writing itself? And I would like to know what is going to do a science journalist like you after this pandemic. What are you planning to write about?
Well, the answer to the first question, you're not going to like. I have 3 children. You're asking me which one I love the most. I love all my children. There are stories I have that I have written that I think are going to be very difficult to write something better. I did a story about polio vaccines before I worked at Science Magazine. I think it was in 1987. And I love the story to this day. The content, the information I had, a man was dying who was paralyzed, and he could blink and write in his diary by blinking his eyes with electronic help. And I had his diary as he died day after day. And I mixed that with science and the vaccine story. And I'm so proud. I love the story to this day. I sometimes reread it just to remember how much satisfaction I had with that story. But I'm also like any other journalist. I'm most excited about the story I'm working on. Where there's a saying in journalism, you're only as good as the last thing you did. And so, yeah, if you ask me today, I like the story I'm working on today a lot. I'm really excited about it.
And Elena Poniatowska, I don't know if you read something about her. She's a Mexican, very famous writer. I interviewed her a few years ago. She told me something that I still remember. She used to say, journalism is a drug. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. A big story is a drug. Absolutely. And you asked me what I intend to do after this big story. Another big story will show up. I I had a writing teacher who once said to me, use everything in your notebooks, use everything you know, because then you make room for more things to come in. So I'm not really worried about what I do next. I'm working on a book about how science can help us prevent the next pandemic. So that will occupy me, but that overlaps with what I'm reporting on right now. And, you know, I don't know, you know, who knows, maybe I'll write an article and someone from Hollywood will call me and say they want to make a movie and give me so much money that I never have to write another day in my life. That would be great.
That would be great, definitely. Please invite me to help.
Hello, Hollywood. No, I don't know, Pablo. I'm open-minded, and so far, I'm 62. I started writing journalism in high school when I was 15. I was the editor of the paper. I have yet to have a day where I didn't have something I wanted to write about. I mean, there are days I don't want to work, but I always have something in the refrigerator that I can cook, you know, always. And I think that's how it will continue.
Jon, I'm really pleased that you accept this invitation, and I know for sure that Fundación Gabo Instituto sorry, it's a difficult Serrafilera for it's also pleased to have you here today. Oficina de Ciencias de la UNESCO. Also, it was a great pleasure to listen to your stories.
Pablo, I must say I'd like to be here all day talking with you. And I also want to say something about Gabriel Garcia Marquez. When I teach writing, I quote the first sentence from 100 Years of Solitude as one of the best examples of how to engage people. Because if you read the first sentence of the book, you have to read the next sentence. And definitely. I think everyone knows the first sentence. And if you don't, go reread it because you'll see his brilliance in that sentence. He plants so many seeds that make you say, what? What? And that to me is great writing, is you move the person to want to read the next sentence.
And it's very interesting that you point out this, because the title we choose for the workshop that we are inviting the people to try to get into is based also in an advice from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He used to say that he learned from his grandfather like a method to be an skeptic about the world and just accept explanations that really fulfill his mind. And even though he's like a fiction writer, well, he was also a great journalist, but his famous books was, I find behind his literature like a science mind in many ways. So that's why we choose this title for the workshop. And so I want to end our conversation here. I know you are in a hurry, and also thanks to everybody who shared with us this hour today. And again, please go into the Fundación Gabo website, read about this program that we are initiating, like we are starting, and we have everybody to commit to make a better best science journalism.
Así es, Pablo. Ahora voy con algo en español. Efectivamente, como tú lo estabas mencionando, tenemos este taller dirigido para periodistas de toda América Latina. Entonces, queremos que se postulen desde ya en la página fundaciongabo.org. Si tienen dudas o inquietudes con respecto a este taller, a las becas o a las mentorías, todo esto hace parte de un programa, me pueden escribir también directamente a mi correo electrónico, que es jbeltran@fundaciongabo.org. Quiero agradecer una vez más a Jon Cohen y a Pablo Correa por haber aceptado nuestra invitación y habernos acompañado en esta sesión. Y bueno, todo esto es posible gracias a la alianza entre la Fundación Gabo y el Instituto Serra Fileira, con el apoyo de la Oficina Regional de Ciencias de la UNESCO para América Latina y el Caribe. Muchas gracias a todos, muchas gracias Pablo, muchas gracias.
Gracias Jon.
Sí, más veces, gracias por invitarme.
Voy a leer tu historia más tarde.
Ok, sí, sí posible comunicar conmigo también con correo. Es muy fácil, es jcohen @AAAS.org. No sé, no recuerdo cómo hable en español.
Estás en Twitter también, estás en Twitter, te pueden conseguir en Twitter.
Sí, verdad.
You're also on Twitter.
Sí.
Thanks, Jon.
Ok, muchas gracias, hasta luego.
Gracias, Jaime.
Buen día.
Chao a todos.
En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 25 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Medellín el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo, promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Siguen por acá.